Well, I am thrilled to be able to be with you through video. My apologies for being unable to be with you in Manila. Um, Unfortunately, I had a little accident. I'm a bicycle rider, and I had an accident a few weeks ago that has caused me to need to be home to deal with the aftermath of that reality. And so it's unfortunate I can't be with you, but I'm glad that technology is going to allow me to spend a few minutes with you talking about one of my great passions, which is evaluation in higher education, and evaluation in the context of education, specifically curriculum. Um, my work for some time academically was to look at evaluation in higher education and how we think of that in relationship specifically to teaching and learning, and then that's related to curriculum. And so for me, this is a real pleasure to be able to share with you some of my thinking about evaluation. So to get started, I want to talk a little bit about what I hope to accomplish. I like to think in terms of learning outcomes as a curricular design element of what I try to do. I'm hoping that by the end of today, we'd be able to collectively talk about how research, evaluation, and assessment all interrelate, and to think of evaluation in new ways. And I really want to focus on the thinking associated with evaluation. That really is the key for me in terms of what I hope to accomplish. Secondly, I think it's really important to be able to articulate how evaluation is a social practice. I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, but also how we might think about motivation in relationship to creating a culture where evaluation is meaningful to the people who are using it, students, teachers, those of us working in higher education in different ways, including administrators, school administrators. But how do we create motivation to have a culture of using evaluation and evidence? I think specifically of evaluation as a social practice, and we're going to talk about that as a really important way to talk about this complex thing that is evaluation. And then I want you to be able to be informed about how we might increase the utility or the consequential validity, as I talk about it, of evaluation. And so that's, how do we make the practice of evaluation meaningful in terms of informing learning, transforming learning environments, and ensuring what we want to have happen is actually happening. This is one of the grand challenges of evaluation of today, is to make it meaningful. We all talk about doing it, but how do we make it meaningful? And then I want you to be able to place yourself about where you see yourself as it relates to evaluation. Are you novice coming to this? And how, if you're novice, do you move from being a novice to becoming more competent in evaluation and using evaluation as a tool in your practice, and even moving people to becoming experts? I think we need to have experts in evaluation. And so this is really where I'm going to take us in the next 30 minutes or so through this presentation. So first thing I want you to do is to take a minute as a group. I know it's on video and I can't see your responses, but I want you to take a minute and I want you to talk with someone about what your experience has been. So think first, what has been your experience with evaluation? When is it most useful? When it has been the least useful? And what are the conditions under which it was either useful or not? So think for a second, and then turn to someone beside you and share with them your response to this. And I'm just going to pause for a minute while that happens. All right, so Here is a challenge. We either had an awkward set of silence, or you all began talking, and it's going to be really hard to get you back to listening to the video and to seeing the slides. So let me try to bring you back. Let me try to bring you back and talk about what research on evaluation tells us in the context of both higher education and advancing learning, and thinking about this both in relationship to curriculum and instruction in particular. What it really tells us is that there is no guarantee that because we do evaluation, that somehow our organizations are going to be better. There really is not, especially as it relates to student learning. What the research actually tells us is that there are some particular conditions under which we might think about doing evaluation, which might and organizational functioning. And I want to talk a little bit about what a few of those conditions are. So first of all, when does evaluation actually enhance learning and program effectiveness? Well, we know from the science of learning that one of the core principles of good learning is encouraging people to engage in metacognitive processes. And metacognitive processes are asking whether we actually know something. So in fact, we know that the utility or pedagogy of evaluation, using evaluation as a learning tool where you ask people to recall information, actually does enhance learning. So you can use evaluation as a mechanism to ask people what they think they know, to make that more clear to them. That is a condition that we know actually enhances learning. In a similar fashion, you can think of the same thing happening as it relates to programmatic evaluation of a curriculum or a program of study. When we actually use that as a mechanism to ask what's actually occurring, and we use it in a proximal fashion, and I'll talk about that in a second, we know that is more likely to change the program than when evaluation is positioned more distally from the interaction you have between the evaluation process and the people who are engaged in the program, the curriculum, whatever it is you have under study. So, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us something really important, that evaluation can be seen, as just by some as simply a set of methodological tools that we apply. But actually, I want us to encourage all of us to think of evaluation as a very complex social practice. Now, what do I mean by a social practice? It means, yes, there are technical elements to it, but really, it's a complex set of skills that we have to employ. So if we want to do good evaluation and we want to systematically collect information, we will have to develop some skills in how we meaningfully collect information. So some level of sophistication about asking people questions. We can ask people questions in the form of interviews. We can ask people questions through our own questions that we then observe for answers. We can ask people questions as it relates to a survey. But we have to have some level of sophistication in how we do that. But that's not enough. You can gather information and not really do evaluation. You then have to make judgments associated with that. And so you end up having the data gathering, the data analysis, the ability to build relationships in a setting. This is a complex set of skills. It's not easy. And I think that's why social practices are seen as really something that we need to develop in collaboration with others, often mentors, who help us to develop this sophisticated set of skills that we then can employ in different settings. And what the real challenge is that I might observe someone do evaluation, and they might be, for instance, examining a curriculum of a program in higher education. They may evaluate that curriculum, and then I want to do the same thing in my university or in my setting. And what I find is that in fact what my experience is very different than what I observed someone else doing. And so the challenge often to evaluation is that the same things done in different contexts result in different things, hence a social practice. It's not simply a technical practice where if you do the right survey design, survey implementation with the right sample, you run the right methods, that ultimately you will get the right thing. Instead, evaluation becomes this complex social practice that requires us as individuals to have increasing complexity and sophistication of skills. It is a set of thinking as well as a complex skill set to be developed. So, all of this takes me back to this idea of what is good evaluation. So how do you know if you're doing good evaluation? Well, one concept that I want to bring to you is this idea of utility, and that good, in fact, is useful or has consequential validity. And part of that then is that when we do evaluation, we have to be concerned with how far away from what we are evaluating we are as individuals. I call this the evaluation loop, where you are working with an evaluation as an individual, and you're working with that evaluation in relationship to a group of people, and you're collecting information with that group of people. And if you collect that information and then you wait 6 months to share back that information with those individuals, a lot of the potential impact and value is gone. Or maybe if you're conducting an evaluation on American higher education, but you're located in the Philippines, and the type of interaction that you have between them actually is quite distant, you have a limited knowledge of each other, the potential impact of that information changes based upon the loop of feedback that you have between data gathering, the individuals from whom the data is gathered, and then sharing information back and what its utility is. So the tightness which we can have as it relates to any evaluation in relationship to how we relate to what we're evaluating becomes a really important concept. Think of this in a classroom where you're concerned with evaluation of student work. If you're evaluating student work and you give them feedback only once a semester or when the semester is over, as opposed to proximal, tight, meaningful feedback, evaluative information, the potential impact of that information when you're giving it in a very quick fashion is much more powerful than if it's very distal and the loop is much longer back to the student in terms of information. Another element I think of evaluation that matters in practice, this social practice, is whether we think of evaluation as an integrated component of our work in education, or whether it is truly something that we add on as an addendum. So if I am taking the development of a curriculum seriously, do I continuously, as a component of the development of the curriculum, as the implementation of the curriculum, consider evaluation to be an integral component, an integral part of what I'm doing? Or do I have someone do that as well on the side afterwards sometimes? Do we take evaluation and give it to the evaluators only? Or do we integrate the thinking of evaluation, the practice of evaluation, into what we are actually doing? And therefore, we use evaluative thought, we use the systematic gathering of information as an essential component of understanding what students need, how they're experiencing our programs and curricular activities and coursework, so that we change and adapt based upon good systematic information that we see as essential to how we think and how we do our jobs. This all then leads to, wow, Andrew, it might sound like I'm talking about everyone should do action research. And so I like to situate evaluation in a spatial map, right? A spatial map of thinking where evaluation and assessment and action research are interrelated terms that overlap, and I think this image does a nice job of thinking of this large operational area of social science research where we are examining social programs, social efforts, social reality. And then within that, you have sort of traditional research thinking that we're going to develop a research question, and we're going to use a set of methods to investigate that question. And if we follow the right procedures and we use the right approaches, we're ultimately going to advance knowledge. And that, of course, is highly related to how we might think of evaluation as a subset of traditional thinking, but actually maybe slightly different, because we might be concerned in evaluation with some additional things beyond just extending knowledge. We might be concerned with the impact on people in a more substantive way. And even within that, then we might have the subset of practice which has been talked about as assessment or assessment of learning, which I see as an outgrowth of evaluative thinking, which is asking how do we know if a program has impact, and then boiling down more slowly into an assessment practice, which can be the assessment of learning. Do we know that students have learned what we intended them to learn? And that, of course, is interrelated and connected with the cycles that we know in action research, where you might be gathering information as you're developing your classroom activities, gathering some systematic data, making changes based upon feedback, gathering more data again, and continuously doing action research related to, similar to evaluation, but not necessarily exactly the same thing, and interrelated with assessment, but not exactly the same. And so you see these regions, right? Evaluation is respectful of social science, but not necessarily exactly the same. It has a definitive practice unto itself. And so language matters here, right? Language helps us to frame our understanding. It helps us to think through, well, what do I have to know if I want to engage in the practice of evaluation in the substantive way? What am I really talking about? Am I talking about evaluation or traditional social science research? How is an individual positioned if they're doing social science research in a traditional way as opposed to positioning someone if they're doing evaluation? And how is that positioning different than someone who wants to do action research in their classroom to improve on a regular basis the experience of students? All of those things are related, but somehow slightly different. So ultimately, this brings me back to what makes for good evaluation practice. Is simply good evaluation practice knowing how to do whatever method you want to do well? I call this methodological fundamentalism, where if I know how to implement an interview process exceptionally well, and if I know then how to analyze interview data well, does that make for good evaluation? So the focus then becomes procedural correctness, that if I do things right, that somehow that will be good practice. Or another approach might be evaluation is good when it makes a difference, when there is utility to what is happening. That is, I do an evaluation in order to improve my program, in order to improve the curriculum. And the extent to which the evaluation helps to improve or gives utility to improving really is the most important thing. Or another approach would be a question of practical philosophy. We might evaluate a curriculum as to whether it is a good thing in the world. Maybe we don't do this enough, right? Maybe we don't focus enough on whether what we're teaching and what we're doing is in fact a good thing for the world, not necessarily just good for students, but a good thing. Within each of these might be the question of whether or not evaluation in the context of education enhances learning for students. And then, of course, we might ask, what learning? So are we evaluating for learning, or are we evaluating the learning? Those might be very different versions of good evaluation. Evaluation for learning might look very different than evaluation of learning, which is simply making a judgment of whether what is happening is good or bad. All of this, of course, can lead us to ethical questions that we might ask. Whatever we're doing, we might say, are we asking the question of who is being served by our programs? How are they being served? So one might ask whether good evaluation practice ultimately also has an ethical lens to it, a really important possibility for how we would think about good. I would say, of course, that good practice must go beyond methodological fundamentalism, that methods matter, that we have to collect information in rigorous, meaningful ways. But it is more important that we engage question of use and ethics than simply focus on good practice, which is why this complex view of evaluation emerges for me, where we have tremendous demands on us to think really critically as we do evaluation in the context of education. I then point you to the work of Marv Alkin, who's at UCLA, not too far from where I live. Marv has written about the roots of evaluation. This is one of the images that he shares. And he talks about a tree, and the tree and the roots that ground the tree are some of the intellectual approaches to evaluation that we've seen over time. And we have a use branch to evaluation, which says that evaluation practice should focus on making sure that what we do in evaluation has utility, that it is helping us to make things better, that the information we gather is truly useful. Or we could focus on the methods branch and say the real way for evaluation to be seen as quality and good is to have the right methodological approach. And the right methodological approach might be, for instance, like Cook and Campbell talk about it, using experimental approaches. The experimental design is the ultimate thing. If we really want to know what works, if we really want to understand education, well, we have to we have to use methods that are the most rigorous. We must have rigorous adherence to those methods. Enticing, in fact, at times, right? It's enticing because we might use strong methods as a means to be at the best, ultimately the best scientific answer. But then there's a whole nother level, which is to suggest that we could consider valuing in evaluation, and we might insert values into this approach. And you see authors like Scriven and Guba Lincoln and Jennifer Green, who was one of my faculty, or House and Howe, who write about democratic deliberative evaluation. And they suggest that one of the roles of evaluation is to hear from all stakeholders regardless of the power positions that they hold. So we might need to listen in particular to students, young students even, and how they are experiencing schooling in our curriculum, and value those just as much as the administrator and the teacher, even though they don't have the same power or potentially knowledge, but that their knowledge is particularly valuable. And our job as evaluators is to consider valuing and how we value as we think about programs. So this gives us an intellectual set of thinking that guides our practice. Do we ultimately think that use and using evaluation matters most? Do we think that our approach needs to be focused on methods? Or are we going to ask ethical questions associated with the values that we apply in an evaluation setting? I think about use. I think that use matters. I think that methods matter, and I think that ethics matter. But I think that use, or consequential validity, is really important. And I like to think of this triangle, where we as practitioners who are trying to deliver education use evaluation to collect systemic information upon which we then can reflect. And that reflection leads us to change our social action. That I don't think we should collect information solely for the purpose of collecting it, that something should change as a result of it in evaluation practice. This is applied work. Yes, it can have meaningful theoretic implications. It can teach us about what are the best practices of things we should and shouldn't do. But ultimately, context and collecting information in our setting and our ability to reflect on it is essential to good evaluation practice. All of this is not easy, and we don't master it overnight. And after today's talk, while I may have given you things to think about, you won't suddenly become an expert in evaluation. In fact, I'm going to suggest that evaluation as a complex social practice means that people, even advanced educators, begin in a novice location. And they begin as a novice, and that means that they have a basic set of skills. You might have the method skills you learned in your graduate program. And then you have to begin to operationalize them, and that takes time, and you have to apply them in a setting. And after you do that, you can become more competent. And after you then have dealt with more sophisticated questions and you have integrated the practice with your underlying theoretic knowledge, you ultimately can elevate yourself to become proficient and drive with real work to becoming expert. And many people never truly become experts because this is a very complex phenomenon of how we think of the social practice of evaluation. So think where you are, right? Do you know methods, but have you applied them in a very complex and messy reality of day-to-day classrooms? Have you done studies and seen the complexity of gathering data and then realizing that it doesn't come out so cleanly as you hoped, and how do I make sense of it? And then, by the way, how do I share that back in a meaningful way, or is it just data that we have that we never quite translate and make sense of? How do we apply that? This is a complex practice. And by the way, in order to sustain a complex practice, we might have to be concerned with motivation. In self-determination theory, a theory of motivation, which I think really matters in the context of evaluation practice, would tell us that people need three things in order to stay motivated on their own in pursuit then of making themselves better evaluators or using evaluation. One, they need to be competent. They need a set of skills. Two, they need relatedness. They need personal support. They need a community in which they can talk about their work. And how many of us as evaluators work in isolation and we want to keep our data to ourselves as opposed to talk about the complexity? And then third, we need to give people the autonomy to do projects on their own, to explore and figure out and deal with the messiness. And it's the interaction of these three pieces: competence, relatedness, autonomy. And with one absent, we often break down in our motivation. So it's a challenge for us to create communities where we engage in evaluative practice. Then we need models, and this is where I end. Hopefully I'm doing well on time. But we end then with conceptual models of practice, where we have to think about how we actually do this in combined fashion. So what does a good evaluation look like? Well, in the United States, a common evaluative narrative is we do evaluation for accountability, because somehow we have to report our results to someone else, whether it's the dean or the principal of the school or a governmental body. And there's a strength to this narrative, right, as we put together a practice. The strength here is that because we have to do it to report to someone else, it's important in the organization and it forces us to do it. But often when we have to do it for someone else, we don't have the buy-in. It's only conducted by a few experts. It's focused externally as opposed to truly being revealing internally and creating authentic information that can change processes. So accountability can be a huge component of evaluative practice, and it constitutes what I think of as one narrative that guides how we think of our evaluation work. A second narrative is the evaluation or assessment cycle that's often talked about in educational organizations. And the assessment cycle says, we're going to plan and implement and assess, and then we're going to report and revise what we were doing, and we're going to continuously do this. And there's such strength to this because it does provide this model of how we do it, and it can focus truly on enhancing learning in an organization because we're planning. We're doing planning around our curriculum, and then we implement an evaluation of it, and then we assess whether that works, and then we return to revise what we're doing, and it can be connected to our strategic work. It can engage us in well-known methods and approaches. But on the other hand, it's simplistic. And maybe it creates a loop that's too far away from practice. It also can be done by someone else as opposed to the people doing practice. It can be integrated with practice, but it also can be done by someone else. And so these are really important questions to think about these narratives. So the second narrative, the first narrative is accountability, the second narrative is assessment. I want to offer you a third narrative. It's mine. It's this book that I've been writing. It's about assessment as a critical, reflexive dialogue, which is a fancy term for how do we make assessment about dialogue. And then I have essentially 5 areas of discussion. I believe that good evaluation and assessment practice, and here I'm thinking specifically about evaluation as the larger practice and assessment as that work that we do to understand learning and what's going on in education. So I use the term assessment here specifically because I'm thinking about how we do this in educational spaces. And I want us to focus first on dialogue, where good evaluative assessment practice is about an ongoing discussion about our work. That means that we have to be honest. We have to do that with others. We have to be reflective of our own work and our organizational work, and it never stops. And secondly, that one of the 5 discussions, and I think of it as the first discussion, must be about what is the purpose of our evaluation work. Are we doing this to improve what we're doing? Are we doing this to gather information for some entity or for some leadership? Are we trying to develop new knowledge? Are we trying to ensure whose voices are heard? Are we doing evaluative work to help people learn, or is it a practice of pedagogy? Are we trying to align our activities with mission? It's so important to understand what the purpose of our work, and so to me it's the first discussion we have. We discuss the purpose or the why of why we want to do an evaluative project. And then second, we would engage questions of ethics. We would have a discussion about power and whose values are at play in a particular evaluation. What are the values? How will we treat subjects? Who should be included? We have to engage ethical questions as an intentional discussion as we think about really good evaluation practice. And by the way, good evaluation isn't so different than good pedagogy, right? So we'd have to talk about the purpose of why we're doing something in our pedagogy. We would have to talk about ethics and who's being served in what ways. We want to raise and surface this in ways maybe we haven't before. And third, we would have to consider, in particular in an assessment or evaluation project, whose interests are being included. So if we're thinking about a curriculum, are we concerned with the interests of parents in the community? Or are we only concerned with the interests of teachers and administrators or some entity of other? Who is included and who is not included in how we think about and how we engage in an evaluation? Now, we haven't even talked about methods yet, right? Because that becomes the fourth discussion, which is we have to then think about what credible evidence will be. And credible evidence is about our method and our techniques, the procedures we'll use. But once we know who our stakeholders are and what the purpose of our evaluation is, we can better align our methodology to make sense. Our approach has to align with the purpose and the ethics we bring and who our stakeholders are. And so no longer are we methodologically prescribed. We end up adapting our methods to what we're doing and who we're doing it with. This is, in fact, a fundamental difference between social science research, where the method is determined by the researcher, and evaluation practice, where our methods are determined by the context, by the stakeholders, by how we ensure that the people with whom we're working will have and see our evidence as credible. And then finally, our fifth discussion to constantly have is to engage in a discussion on what will we do as a result of gathering information. Toward what end does this happen? Will it have validity? Can we change things based upon information? What can we change? How will we use information? Of course, this relates strongly to purpose. It connects back to credible evidence. It engages us in thinking about, again, who our stakeholders are. So we have this dialogue, this ongoing dialogue that becomes a version of what's important. I put this then into cycle of implementation, where you can identify purpose. I did this with students who said, Andrew, your approach to evaluation is exciting and interesting, but not practical. And so what does this look like in actually conducting an evaluation work? And so we added the cycle, right? The cycle of how we might move from one thing to another and determine what we're doing and actually engage in a practice. There are great challenges in evaluation. The use of evaluation, truly integrating it. I'm a huge believer that we should use this to drive improvement. I know that sometimes it's co-opted by a narrative of accountability. Other times it's seen as done to us. But how might we have a dialogue on an ongoing basis that truly asks us to transform our educational practice and look deeply into how we look at our programs? It's a way of thinking, it's a way of being, as well as a complex social practice that asks us to move from being novices to becoming increasingly more knowledgeable. Thank you so much. I hope that I'm able to take a few questions using technology. My very best.